Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, a single event tore a hole in the fabric of the 20th century. A routine safety test at a Soviet nuclear power plant spiraled into the worst nuclear disaster in human history. It was a catastrophe that poisoned the land, shattered lives, and unleashed a silent, invisible enemy upon the world. This is the story of Chernobyl, a name forever synonymous with nuclear terror, human error, and the unimaginable cost of a lie. In the vast, marshy woodlands of northern Ukraine, a dream was being forged from concrete and steel. This was Pripyat, a city born of the atom. Founded on February 4, 1970, it wasn't just another dot on the Soviet map. It was an atomgrad, a nuclear city, purpose-built to serve the colossal Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant just 3 kilometers away. Pripyat was a showcase of the Soviet ideal, a testament to the promise of peaceful nuclear energy. It was a city of the future, designed for the best and brightest. The average age of its nearly 50,000 residents was a mere 26. These were the engineers, the scientists, the technicians, and their young families, drawn by the allure of a life far superior to that in other parts of the Union. The city boasted modern apartment blocks with all the amenities, 15 primary schools, 5 secondary schools, a hospital, numerous shops, cafes, and a grand cultural center named Energetic. It had a pristine amusement park, complete with a now iconic Ferris wheel, set to open for the May Day celebrations of 1986. Life here was idyllic, insulated from the shortages and drabness that plagued much of the Soviet Union. The air was clean, the forests were lush, and the Pripyat River offered opportunities for recreation. The residents felt a profound sense of pride. They were at the vanguard of scientific progress, powering a nation and living in a purpose-built utopia. This city was their reward, a symbol of their importance to the state. They were living proof that the atom could be a benevolent servant, providing clean, limitless energy. The 4 towering reactors of the Chernobyl plant on the horizon weren't a source of fear, but a source of prosperity, the very heart that pumped life and light into their perfect world. Little did they know, this meticulously planned paradise was built on the edge of a precipice, its foundation rooted in a technology that contained a terrible, hidden flaw. The heart of the Chernobyl plant, and the source of Pripyat's prosperity, was the RBMK 1000 reactor. The Reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny, or high-power channel-type reactor, was a uniquely Soviet design, a behemoth of graphite and uranium. On the surface, it was a marvel of engineering, capable of generating a massive 1,000 megawatts of electricity. But its design was a product of the Cold War, shaped by a dual purpose that prioritized military needs over absolute safety. Unlike the pressurized water reactors common in the West, which used water as both a coolant and a moderator, the RBMK used water as a coolant but solid graphite blocks as a moderator to sustain the nuclear chain reaction. This design made it cheaper to build and easier to refuel online, but it harbored a deadly secret: a positive void coefficient. In simple terms, if the water coolant turned to steam, instead of slowing the reaction down as it would in Western reactors, the RBMK's reaction would dangerously speed up. It was a feedback loop from hell. Compounding this fundamental flaw, was the design of the control rods. Made of boron carbide, their function was to absorb neutrons and slow or stop the reaction. However, to save costs, the tips of these rods were made of graphite. When the rods were inserted into the core, these graphite tips would momentarily displace water and accelerate the reaction before the boron carbide could slow it down. It was like hitting the brakes on a car and having it accelerate for a few crucial seconds before stopping. Finally, and perhaps most critically, the RBMK 1000 lacked a proper containment structure. The massive concrete and steel domes that are a last line of defense in other nuclear plants were simply absent, deemed an unnecessary expense. Soviet nuclear scientists were aware of these flaws. They knew the reactor could be unstable at low power, but this information was classified, a state secret buried under layers of bureaucracy and institutional pride. The machine was a titan, but a titan with a fatal weakness, a ticking time bomb at the heart of a nation's ambition. On the evening of April 25, 1986, the crew of Chernobyl's Reactor 4 was preparing for a seemingly routine safety test. The objective was to determine if, in the event of a total power failure, the plant's spinning steam turbines could generate enough residual electricity to power the emergency water cooling pumps until the backup diesel generators kicked in. This was a critical safety procedure designed to prevent a core meltdown. However, a series of events conspired to turn this test into a prelude to catastrophe. The test was originally scheduled for the afternoon, to be overseen by the experienced day shift. But a regional power dispatcher requested that the reactor remain online to meet electricity demands, delaying the test by nearly 10 hours. By the time the plant was given the green light to proceed, it was late into the night, and a new, less experienced crew had taken over. This night shift, led by the 26-year-old Leonid Toptunov and overseen by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, was not adequately briefed on the test's specific procedures. Under pressure from Dyatlov to complete the delayed test, the operators began to power down the reactor. In a critical error, the power level fell far too low, dropping to a near-stalled state where the reactor became extremely unstable. To bring the power back up to the level required for the test, the operators made a series of fateful and reckless decisions, violating numerous safety regulations. They disabled automatic shutdown systems and manually withdrew almost all of the control rods from the core, effectively removing the reactor's primary braking system. They were now operating a notoriously volatile machine in its most dangerous state with virtually no safety margin. The reactor was poisoned with xenon, a byproduct of fission, which further complicated its behavior. The stage was now set. The flawed design of the RBMK, combined with a poorly planned test and a cascade of human errors born from haste and pressure, had created the perfect storm. At 1:23:40 a.m. on April 26th, the test officially began. The steam to the turbines was shut off, and the operators watched their instruments to see if the coasting turbines could power the pumps. The results were not what they expected. As the water flow decreased, steam voids began to form rapidly in the core. The reactor's fatal flaw, its positive void coefficient, kicked in with ferocious speed. Power began to surge uncontrollably. In the control room, alarms shrieked as the operators stared in disbelief at the readouts. Realizing the imminent danger, the shift supervisor gave the final, desperate order: initiate an emergency shutdown. Leonid Toptunov pressed the AZ-5 button, the scram switch designed to drive all control rods into the core and stop the reaction instantly. But instead of saving them, this action sealed their fate. As the control rods descended, their graphite tips entered the core first. This displaced the remaining water coolant, causing an instantaneous, catastrophic power spike. The reactor's output surged to over 100 times its nominal capacity in less than 4 seconds. The immense energy release ruptured the fuel channels. A few seconds later, at 01:23:47 a.m., a colossal steam explosion ripped through the heart of Reactor 4. The blast, with the force of hundreds of tons of TNT, obliterated the reactor hull and sent the 2,000-ton upper biological shield, a lid known as Elena, hurtling into the air. It crashed back down into the reactor vessel, leaving the core wide open. In the control room, the men were thrown from their feet by the violent tremor. Dust and debris rained down from the collapsing ceiling. They stared at their panels, which showed nothing but errors. They couldn't comprehend what had just happened. They believed the reactor was still intact, that a hydrogen tank had exploded. They were tragically wrong. The heart of the atom had been shattered, and its radioactive contents were now exposed to the night sky. In the silent pre-dawn hours of April 26, 1986, the universe held its breath. At precisely 1:23:40 a.m., a routine safety test at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant's Reactor No. 4 went catastrophically wrong. A sudden, violent power surge triggered a steam explosion that ripped the 2,000-ton steel and concrete lid from the reactor core, tossing it aside like a coin. Seconds later, a second, more powerful explosion, likely a hydrogen blast, tore through the building, ejecting a plume of superheated radioactive graphite and uranium fuel into the night sky. The heart of the atom had been laid bare. For the residents of the nearby city of Pripyat, woken by the thunderous booms, the sight was surreal, almost beautiful. A column of fire roared into the sky, painting the clouds with an unnatural, multicolored light. Most mesmerizing of all was an ethereal, shimmering pillar of blue-white light that reached high into the atmosphere, seeming to connect the Earth with the stars. This was the azure glow of Chernobyl radiation, the visible signature of air molecules being ionized by an unimaginable torrent of radioactive particles. It was a beautiful, deadly fire, a siren's call luring onlookers to their doom. On a railway bridge, later nicknamed the Bridge of Death, people gathered to watch the spectacle, completely unaware that the soft breeze carried a lethal dose of gamma radiation. They were being showered with particles that would rewrite their cellular structure. Inside the mangled remains of the control room, the operators were in a state of shock and disbelief. Their instruments gave nonsensical readings or were completely dead. They were trained for containment breaches, not the complete obliteration of the reactor itself. They reported a fire, a damaged hydrogen tank, anything but the unthinkable truth that the core was open to the sky, spewing a poison 1,000,000 times more potent than the bomb at Hiroshima. A poison that would contaminate a continent and alter the course of history. Within minutes of the first alarm, the silence of the night was shattered by the wail of sirens. Fire brigades from Pripyat and the plant itself raced towards the inferno, believing they were responding to a conventional roof fire. They were ordinary men, armed with little more than canvas hoses, standard-issue uniforms, and extraordinary courage. They had no dosimeters, no protective gear for a radiological event, and no idea they were charging into the mouth of a nuclear volcano. Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik and his crew were among the first to arrive. Ascending the ladder to the roof of the turbine hall, they were met with a scene from hell. The air was thick with a strange metallic taste, a classic sign of intense radiation. Their throats burned, and waves of nausea and violent coughing fits immediately began to rack their bodies. Yet, they did not retreat. They unrolled their hoses and began to fight. They were walking on chunks of highly radioactive graphite moderator, ejected from the core, pieces so lethal that standing near one for a single minute would deliver a fatal dose. Their boots began to melt in the intense heat and chemical residue. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, taste, or feel, an invisible force that was tearing their bodies apart on a molecular level. Every drop of water they sprayed on the burning graphite turned into radioactive steam, further poisoning the air they breathed. For hours, these men and the plant workers who joined them battled dozens of separate fires, preventing the blaze from spreading to the adjacent and still operational Reactor 3. Had that reactor also exploded, the resulting disaster would have rendered most of Europe uninhabitable. Their actions were heroic beyond measure, a testament to human duty in the face of the unimaginable. But it was a suicide mission. By sunrise, many of these brave first responders, their skin turned a deep nuclear tan of crimson and bronze, were already being transported away, their bodies having absorbed doses of radiation from which there was no recovery. As dawn broke over the smoldering reactor, a far more insidious poison began to spread from Moscow. Silence. The initial reports that reached the Kremlin were fragmented, censored, and deliberately downplayed. In the rigid, hierarchical Soviet system, no one wanted to be the bearer of catastrophic news. Local officials, desperate to avoid panic and reprisal from their superiors, insisted the situation was stable and under control. While an invisible cloud of radioactive isotopes billowed into the sky, the city of Pripyat was ordered to maintain a facade of normalcy. Schools opened, children played in the streets, and 17 weddings took place that Saturday, their participants unknowingly breathing in deadly fallout. The state-controlled media reported nothing. The first government commission, led by Valery Legasov and Boris Shcherbina, was dispatched, but even they were not initially told the full truth. The prevailing ideology was that a Soviet reactor, a pinnacle of their engineering prowess, simply could not explode in such a manner. Admitting the truth would be a monumental humiliation on the world stage. This wall of denial was not just political, it was deadly. A swift evacuation of Pripyat and the surrounding 10-kilometer zone could have saved thousands from devastating radiation exposure. Instead, the buses sat idle as the critical hours ticked by. The silence extended beyond Soviet borders. When Swedish monitoring stations began detecting alarming levels of radiation 2 days later, they initially suspected a leak at their own plant. Only after confirming their own systems were secure did they realize the fallout was drifting from the east. When they formally questioned Moscow, they were met with a flat denial. The Kremlin's secrecy was a direct product of the Cold War mentality, where any admission of failure was seen as a victory for the enemy. But this was an enemy that respected no borders and acknowledged no ideology. While the government built a wall of silence, the radioactive cloud continued its silent, inexorable journey across the continent. a contagion of lies and isotopes. The fire burning in Reactor 4 was more than a simple blaze. It was a thermodynamic engine, pumping a column of heat and radioactive particles more than a kilometer into the atmosphere. Once aloft, this toxic plume became a hostage to the prevailing winds, beginning a grim odyssey across the globe. It was a silent contagion, an invisible armada carrying isotopes like iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90. The initial wind patterns carried the most concentrated part of the cloud northwest, first over Belarus, which received over 70% of the total fallout, contaminating a quarter of its territory and poisoning its rich agricultural lands for generations. From there, it drifted over Poland and the Baltic states before sweeping across Scandinavia. On the morning of Monday, April 28th, over 1,000 kilometers away at the Forsmark Nuclear Power Plant in Sweden, a worker returning from the restroom set off radiation alarms. Panic ensued as officials scrambled to find a leak within their own facility. But after thorough checks confirmed their plant was secure, they analyzed the worker's shoes. The isotopes found were a specific fingerprint, characteristic of a Soviet RBMK reactor. The truth was out. The Swedes' public announcement forced the Kremlin's hand. That evening, on the state television news program Vremya, an announcer read a terse 20-second statement, admitting only that an accident had occurred at Chernobyl and that measures were being taken. It was a stunning understatement of a global catastrophe. As the days turned into weeks, the shifting winds carried the contamination further, depositing radioactive material across Western Europe, from Italy and France to Great Britain and Ireland. The silent contagion had infiltrated everything: the soil, the water, the food chain. A nuclear accident in one corner of Ukraine had become the world's problem, a terrifying demonstration that in the atomic age, no border is truly sealed and no secret can be kept from the wind. The end of Akhetaten was not a slow decline, but a sudden, catastrophic rupture. It was an evacuation. Following the death of the pharaoh Akhenaten and the subsequent baffling disappearance of his queen, Nefertiti, the city they had built as the crucible of their new world was abandoned with a speed that defies belief. Imagine the scene. One day, a bustling metropolis of perhaps 50,000 souls, its streets echoing with hymns to the sun god, Aten. The next, an eerie silence descends, broken only by the desert wind. The order to leave must have been absolute, the threat palpable. This was not a migration. It was a flight from an unseen poison. The poison wasn't radiation, but something just as deadly in their world: ideological collapse and political terror. The old gods, banished for a generation, were returning with a vengeance, and their priests would show no mercy to the adherents of the heresy. The people of Akhetaten left everything behind. In the excavated homes of artisans, we find tools dropped mid-task. In the kitchens of villas, we see food preparation areas left as if the cook had just stepped out. Children's toys lie scattered on dusty floors, silent witnesses to a life interrupted. The city became a ghost town overnight, a perfect, sun-bleached snapshot of the moment the Amarna experiment died. This hurried exodus is one of the most critical and confounding pieces in the puzzle of Nefertiti's disappearance. Did she flee with them, a refugee disguised amongst the masses? Or was her removal from power the very catalyst for the evacuation, the final signal that the protective shield of Aten had shattered? The city itself, frozen in time, offers no clear answers. It stands as a silent, sprawling tomb, not for a single pharaoh, but for an entire epoch, its abandonment as sudden and total as a city fleeing a meltdown, leaving us to wander its spectral streets, searching for the ghost of its lost queen. In the aftermath of the disaster, with Akhetaten deserted and the royal family in disarray, a new force emerged from the shadows of Thebes. They were the Liquidators, not men in lead suits, but men in the white linen robes of the Amun priesthood, accompanied by soldiers and scribes loyal to the old ways. Their mission was not to contain a physical contamination, but a spiritual one. To them, the entire Amarna period was a cancerous growth on the soul of Egypt, and their sacred duty was to excise it completely. These were not mere vandals. They were systematic, organized, and utterly ruthless in their task. They moved through the abandoned city and across the length of Egypt with a chilling efficiency. Their targets were the images, and most importantly, the names of the heretic king and his family. The name, to an ancient Egyptian, was an essential part of the soul, necessary for eternal life. To destroy the name was to condemn a person to utter oblivion. These liquidators were the agents of that second, more permanent death. They climbed temple walls and palace facades, their chisels ringing in the silent air as they methodically hacked away the cartouches of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Aten himself. They were heroes in their own eyes, warriors restoring Ma'at, the divine order, to a land plunged into chaos. The hell they faced was the monumental task of undoing a generation of religious revolution. Every inscription, every statue, every relief had to be found and cleaned. This meticulous campaign of erasure is precisely why Nefertiti's story becomes so fragmented. Her face was hammered into dust, her name scraped from existence. The liquidators did their job too well, creating a void in the historical record that has baffled historians for centuries. They sought to purify Egypt, but in doing so, they ensured the disappearance of its most famous queen. Containing a disaster of this magnitude required more than just a cleanup operation. It required a final, monumental act of containment. A sarcophagus had to be built. For the successors of Akhenaten, the dragon was the living memory of the Amarna heresy, a fiery, chaotic beast that had scorched the traditions of the nation. Burying this dragon meant sealing away not just the ideology, but its physical epicenter, the city of Akhetaten. The construction of this historical sarcophagus was a multi-generational project. It began with the physical abandonment of the city, allowing the first layers of sand to begin the slow process of burial. Then came the official state-sponsored damnatio memoriae, the chiseling away of names, which acted as a lead shield against the memory's toxic influence. But the final structure was the rewriting of history itself. Pharaohs like Horemheb enacted edicts that officially condemned Akhenaten as the enemy and sought to legislate his reign out of existence. King lists were carved that deliberately omitted his name and those of his immediate successors, jumping from his father directly to Horemheb as if the entire Amarna period had never occurred. This was the final seal on the sarcophagus. They were building a new reality over the contaminated ground. Akhetaten was left to the desert, its stone temples dismantled and reused in other projects, its mud brick walls dissolving back into the earth. The dragon was being interred. This grand act of historical engineering is the ultimate reason for the mystery of Nefertiti. She was sealed inside this sarcophagus of silence along with her husband and her god. By burying the city and erasing the timeline, the restorers of the old order created the perfect void, a sealed chamber in history from which no information was meant to escape. They succeeded for 3,000 years, until a new generation of explorers began to dig, unknowingly cracking the seal on the tomb of a forgotten age. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion at Chernobyl's Reactor 4, as firefighters battled a blaze unlike any they had ever seen, the nearby city of Pripyat slept, largely unaware of the cataclysm unfolding just a few kilometers away. But as dawn approached on April 26, 1986, some were awakened by the commotion, drawn to their windows by the strange, beautiful, and terrifying glow in the night sky. From their apartment balconies, they witnessed a pillar of ethereal blue light rising from the plant, a mesmerizing spectacle that belied its lethal nature. It was in this atmosphere of ignorance and morbid curiosity that one of Chernobyl's most enduring and chilling legends was born: the story of the Bridge of Death. The urban legend tells of residents, including families with young children, gathering on a railway bridge that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the burning reactor. They were said to have treated it like a fireworks display, watching the colorful flames dance against the dark sky, completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing in the direct path of a dense, invisible plume of radioactive isotopes. The wind that night carried the fallout directly over this location, showering the spectators with particles of uranium, plutonium, and other fission products. According to the legend, every single person who stood on that bridge to watch the fire would be dead within weeks, succumbing to horrific radiation sickness. While the story is a potent and horrifying symbol of the invisible danger, its factual accuracy is debated by historians and survivors. It is true that the bridge was one of the most heavily contaminated spots in Pripyat, with radiation levels high enough to deliver a fatal dose in a matter of hours. However, there is little concrete evidence to support the claim of a large crowd gathering there or a subsequent mass death of all onlookers. The legend more likely serves as a grim amalgamation of real events, a cautionary tale born from the very real tragedy that unfolded. The Bridge of Death may be more myth than documented fact, but it powerfully encapsulates the fatal naivety of the first hours and the cruel, silent lethality of the poison that filled the air. The true cost of the Chernobyl disaster was not measured in destroyed concrete or economic loss, but in human lives, consumed by an enemy they could neither see nor fight. For the first responders, the plant workers and firefighters who rushed into the radioactive inferno, the consequences were immediate and agonizing. They were exposed to gargantuan doses of radiation, thousands of times the lethal limit, initiating a swift and irreversible breakdown of their bodies known as acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. The initial symptoms were deceptive. Many experienced a metallic taste in their mouth, uncontrollable vomiting, and severe headaches within hours of exposure. This was followed by a latency period, cruelly dubbed the walking ghost phase, where the symptoms would subside. For a few days, some felt well enough to believe they might recover. But this was merely a biological lull before the final, catastrophic assault. The ionizing radiation had shredded their cellular structure, starting with the most vulnerable, the bone marrow, the immune system, and the lining of the intestinal tract. In the final stage, their bodies disintegrated. Their skin, burned from the inside out by beta particles that had settled on it, turned from red to black, blistering and sloughing off in sheets. Their immune systems collapsed, leaving them defenseless against infection. Their internal organs failed one by one. The story of firefighter Vasily Ignatenko, who was on the roof of Reactor 3, is a harrowing testament to this suffering. Flown to a specialized hospital in Moscow, his body became a vessel of unimaginable pain. He coughed up pieces of his own internal organs, his skin cracked and bled, and his loved ones could only watch in horror as he physically fell apart over 2 excruciating weeks. He was just one of 28 first responders who died of ARS in the immediate aftermath. Their heroic sacrifice paid for with the most torturous death imaginable. Their ordeal stands as a stark, unforgettable warning of the profound human cost of nuclear catastrophe. For 2 full days, the Soviet Union remained silent. As the graphite fire in Reactor 4 burned uncontrollably, it created a thermal plume that acted like a chimney, pumping a vast cocktail of radioactive isotopes high into the atmosphere. The world outside the Iron Curtain remained blissfully unaware of the nuclear nightmare unfolding in Ukraine. But the poison was now airborne, a silent, invisible cloud that respected no borders. Carried by prevailing winds, the initial plume drifted northwest, across Belarus and Lithuania, towards Scandinavia. The first alarm was sounded not in Moscow or Kyiv, but over 1,100 kilometers away at the Forsmark Nuclear Power Plant in Sweden on the morning of April 28th. When a worker returning from the restroom set off radiation detectors, the plant initially suspected a leak on their own premises. But after confirming their reactors were secure, they checked the wider environment and found elevated levels of specific isotopes, a signature that pointed not to a commercial reactor leak, but to a major nuclear accident. As other monitoring stations across Finland and Scandinavia reported similar findings, they traced the fallout's trajectory back to the Soviet Union. The secret was out. Faced with undeniable evidence and mounting international pressure, the Kremlin's wall of silence began to crack. That evening, a terse 20-second announcement on Soviet state television admitted that an accident had occurred at the Chernobyl plant. The world was now on high alert. Panic began to spread across Europe as news channels broadcast terrifying, color-coded maps tracking the radioactive cloud's path. Countries began issuing urgent warnings. In Poland, millions of children were given iodine tablets to protect their thyroids. In Italy, the sale of leafy vegetables was banned. In Germany, playgrounds were closed, and farmers were ordered to keep their cattle indoors. The Chernobyl disaster was no longer a local Soviet problem. It had become a global crisis, a terrifying demonstration that the consequences of a nuclear meltdown could drift across continents, threatening the health and safety of millions who lived thousands of kilometers from the source. In the smoldering ruins of Reactor 4, amidst the frantic efforts to contain the radioactive fallout, a second, equally critical battle began: the fight for the truth. The world demanded answers, and the Soviet state, built on secrecy and control, was forced to launch an investigation. A government commission was formed, led by Valery Legasov, a prominent inorganic chemist and first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. Legasov and his team were flown into the disaster zone, where they faced the monumental task of piecing together the events that led to the explosion. The initial narrative, heavily promoted by the state, was one of gross incompetence and reckless human error. The official story placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of the plant's director and the engineers, who were conducting a long-delayed safety test on the night of the accident. They were accused of violating countless safety protocols, pushing the reactor into an unstable state from which it could not recover. And while there was undeniable truth to the operator error, Legasov and other scientists quickly realized this was only half the story. As they delved deeper, they uncovered a far more damning truth buried within the reactor's very design. The RBMK 1000 reactor had catastrophic design flaws, known to its creators but kept secret from its operators. Chief among these was the positive void coefficient, a characteristic that could cause a runaway power surge under low power conditions. Compounding this was the fatal design of the control rods. Tipped with graphite, they would momentarily increase rather than decrease reactivity when first inserted into the core. It was this precise action, the desperate push of the emergency shutdown button, that triggered the final, massive explosion. Legasov was tasked with presenting these findings to the world at a conference of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. He walked a political tightrope, courageously revealing more about the design flaws than Moscow wanted, yet still emphasizing human error to protect the reputation of the Soviet nuclear industry. The investigation ultimately led to a show trial where the plant's managers were made scapegoats. But the full truth about a flawed design wrapped in a culture of secrecy had begun to emerge, forever changing the global perception of nuclear safety. The immediate, fiery horror of the Chernobyl explosion was only the prelude to a far longer, more insidious tragedy. As the radioactive plume drifted across Europe, it sowed an invisible poison that would contaminate the very building blocks of life for a generation. The first victims were the liquidators, the firefighters, soldiers, and miners who were thrown into the breach with little to no protection. They were heroes who fought an unseen enemy, absorbing catastrophic doses of radiation to contain the disaster. Thousands would die from acute radiation sickness in the weeks and years that followed, while many more would suffer from cancers and other chronic illnesses for the rest of their shortened lives. Their sacrifice saved millions, but it came at a terrible cost, a debt paid in their own health and vitality. Beyond the immediate responders, the contamination settled upon the land, entering the food chain and the water supply. In the heavily affected regions of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, a terrifying spike in thyroid cancer among children soon became apparent. Radioactive iodine, absorbed by the thyroid gland, delivered its lethal payload to the most vulnerable. Hospitals filled with children undergoing surgeries and treatments for a disease that should be vanishingly rare. The term Chernobyl children entered the global lexicon, a heartbreaking symbol of the disaster's long reach. These were children born with birth defects, compromised immune systems, and a host of health problems that would shadow their entire existence. The psychological toll was just as devastating. Millions lived in a state of constant fear, a radiophobia that permeated every aspect of daily life. Was the food safe to eat? Was the water safe to drink? Every minor illness sparked the terrifying question. Was it the radiation? This pervasive anxiety created a generation scarred not just physically, but emotionally, grappling with the trauma of displacement, loss, and the constant, nagging uncertainty of their own futures. In the wake of the disaster, the Soviet authorities established a perimeter of alienation, a dead zone from which humanity was banished. This 30-kilometer radius around the stricken reactor became the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, an apocalyptic landscape where time stood still. In the immediate aftermath, the environment bore witness to the radiation's raw power. The red forest, a tract of pine trees directly downwind of the explosion, absorbed such a massive dose that the needles turned a ghostly ginger brown and died, creating a haunting, rust-colored woodland. Domestic animals left behind in the hasty evacuation were systematically culled to prevent the spread of contamination. The world watched, assuming this land was permanently lost, a testament to humanity's capacity for self-destruction. But then, something remarkable happened. In the absence of its most dominant and destructive species, humans, nature began to reclaim its territory. Freed from the pressures of agriculture, industry, and urban development, the exclusion zone underwent a startling transformation. The concrete streets of Pripyat began to crack, giving way to grass and saplings. Buildings became vertical forests, their windows and roofs consumed by vegetation. More astonishingly, wildlife began to return and thrive. Populations of elk, roe deer, and wild boar exploded. The zone became a sanctuary for species under pressure elsewhere in Europe. The rare and endangered Przewalski's horse, a species of wild horse, was introduced and established a flourishing population. Most significantly, wolves, the apex predators, returned in numbers not seen in the region for a century. This unexpected resurgence created a paradox that continues to fascinate scientists. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone is simultaneously one of the most radioactively contaminated places on Earth and a thriving haven for biodiversity. It has become a unique, if accidental, ecological experiment, forcing us to question our understanding of radiation's long-term impact and to witness the profound resilience of the natural world when humanity simply steps aside. Decades after the world's worst nuclear disaster, the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone has undergone another strange transformation. It has become a tourist destination. Every year, thousands of visitors pass through the military checkpoints to enter this land frozen in time. They come to witness the ghost city of Pripyat, a modern-day Pompeii that serves as a chilling monument to the catastrophe. Guided tours lead visitors through silent, decaying schoolrooms where books and gas masks still litter the floors. They stand before the iconic rusting Ferris wheel in the city's amusement park, which was set to open just days after the disaster, but never did. The atmosphere is heavy, with a palpable sense of loss and abrupt departure. Geiger counters crackle, reminding everyone of the invisible danger that still saturates the soil. This rise of dark tourism raises complex ethical questions about voyeurism and respect for tragedy. Yet for many, the journey is a pilgrimage, a way to comprehend the scale of the event and pay respects to its victims. Beyond the tourist trails, Chernobyl remains a working industrial site. The original, hastily built sarcophagus over Reactor 4 was crumbling, threatening another release of radioactive dust. In a monumental feat of engineering, the new Safe Confinement, a colossal steel arch larger than a football stadium, was constructed and slid into place over the old structure in 2016. It is designed to safely contain the reactor's remains for the next century, allowing for the eventual dismantling of the ruins within. Scientists, engineers, and thousands of workers continue their shifts inside the zone, monitoring radiation levels and managing nuclear waste. And in a final, poignant twist, a small community of Samosli, or self-settlers, exists within the zone. These are mostly elderly residents who defied the authorities and illegally returned to their ancestral villages, choosing to live out their days on contaminated land rather than die of a broken heart in a faraway city apartment. They represent a stubborn, human testament to the power of home. The legacy of Chernobyl is far more than a contaminated landscape and a lingering health crisis. It is a deep scar on the modern world's psyche. The disaster delivered a fatal blow to the Soviet Union's credibility. The government's initial secrecy, denial, and incompetence exposed the moral and systemic rot at the heart of the regime, accelerating the public's loss of faith and contributing significantly to its eventual collapse just 5 years later. Globally, Chernobyl shattered the myth of perfectly safe nuclear power. It triggered widespread anti-nuclear protests and led to a dramatic slowdown in the construction of new reactors for decades. Safety protocols across the world were fundamentally reassessed and strengthened, creating a new international culture of transparency and oversight embodied by organizations like the IAEA. The disaster forced humanity to confront the terrifying, long-term consequences of its most powerful technology. Yet, the central question remains: have we truly learned the lessons of Chernobyl? The 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan, triggered by a tsunami, was a stark reminder that even a nation with a stellar reputation for engineering and safety is not immune to nuclear catastrophe. As the world grapples with the existential threat of climate change, nuclear power is once again being promoted as a clean energy solution. The debate rages on, with the memory of Chernobyl casting a long shadow over every discussion. The enduring legacy of that April night in 1986 is a complex tapestry of heroism, tragedy, ecological paradox, and political upheaval. It serves as a permanent, cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, the necessity of truth, and the profound responsibility that comes with wielding the power of the atom. It reminds us that some mistakes have consequences that span centuries, and that the price of forgetting the past is to risk repeating it.